here in for a treat, ladies and gentlemen. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Warrell to the dais, and we will all have the pleasure of listening to him. Thank you.
Buddha, that was so generous and such a lot of hyperbole. After that, anything I say is bound to be a disappointment, I'm afraid. And frankly, I didn't recognize the person he was describing. I think that Buddha's had one of these age-related sort of shifts of memory. So, anyway, thank you so much. That really is very generous. Of course, I'm extremely grateful to all the organisers. I won't list them, but Isabella, who I've only just met, and Sanjeev, who's an old friend, and all the other people involved in this meeting. And so nice to see so many friends in the audience from my friends and collaborators in Asia. So I've been given the hot seat today to really address this key question: why should we invest in snakebite at this moment? And we can all invest in our different ways. We don't have to be millionaires. We just need to have enthusiasm. So we can all do advocacy. That means boring our friends and relations and our colleagues with the news that snakebite needs some attention. So whether it's political, medical, scientific, or social. And it's marvellous that Rotary, which is a marvellous social organisation in so many countries, is supporting this meeting. And we can all devote some time and effort and thought. That's often the missing thing. Thought leading to innovation. So what new ideas can we bring to this old subject? And many people in the audience are doing what is closest to my heart as a clinician. They're looking after patients, victims of snakebite. And then we're all involved in education and some of us in research. Finally, the most familiar area of investment is, of course, financial investment, and that is terribly important. And this can be at the government level, international agencies. They are beginning to wake up to the promise, the excitement, the potential of snakebite, foundations and charities and NGOs. And why now? Why should we think about snakebite now? And I mean today. Is it the 2nd of August? Have I got that straight? Yes. I get a bit disorientated when I travel. But these are the reasons why it's now. This is August 2019. Unprecedented opportunities for doing something about this age-old problem. We've heard about WHO's renaissance. They're waking up to this problem through a series of steps, putting it on their list of NTDs, category A. Then there's this very powerful World Health Assembly resolution, which has empowered WHO to activate all its country branches in the cause of snakebite. And then finally, the production of this marvellous document. I mustn't say it's marvellous because I was involved slightly in it, but it was really a very important document, which the main architect was David Williams, the strategy document for prevention and control. So WHO is really doing its bit. Then there are some donors coming forward. The United Kingdom Department of International Development, with an unlikely coupling with the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, IAVI. What on earth has that got to do with snakebite, you'll wonder? And the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, they got a £9 million grant, pounds sterling, and the Wellcome Trust of the United Kingdom, a massive sum, 80 million over the next 7 years. For years, ladies and gentlemen, I've been pleading with the Wellcome Trust to just give me a little money. And now, because they think I'm well out of the way, well retired, they're going to flood the field with £80 million. It's fantastic news. And I'm glad to say that some private charities are coming forward. The Lillian Lincoln Foundation of the United States has been very generous in supporting various key activities, and from the United Kingdom, the Hamish Ogston Foundation. And we're very grateful and hope that this current publicity for snakebite, this raising of the profile of snakebite, will encourage many other groups to come forward. So, down to the subject of my talk again, why invest in snakebite? I know this is a very critical audience. You're not just going to rush off and invest. You're going to need very tightly argued, with lots of evidence, arguments for this. And I can think of at least 10 good reasons, and I'm going to take you through these 10 good reasons. First of all, I think we now have very good evidence that snakebite is the most neglected of all the neglected tropical diseases. And this confidence that we really are tackling an enormous public health problem is based on, so far, just very few community-based national surveys. And I think probably the most important of these were the Registrar General of India's Million Death Study. This assessed the cause of death by verbal autopsy, which is not a universally sound technique for assessing death, but in the case of snakebite, it is pretty reliable because, as you can imagine, the event of someone dying from snakebite in your family or your village is pretty memorable. It's dramatic. And so people were able to come forward and give a sound cause of death from snakebite. And this was a meticulously designed study with about 1,000 groups of 1,000 people in 7,000 randomly selected sample areas throughout the whole of this vast country of India. It was independent of that usual problem of hospital underreporting, because patients don't go to hospital, they seek other types of treatment. And the staggering figure of deaths attributable to snakebite was 46,000, and that gives the, in parentheses there, the 99% confidence intervals. To put this in proportion, we all know about HIV/AIDS, that's a million-killing disease. There are 2 HIV deaths for every 1 snakebite death. I think that's pretty impressive. This is relating it to one's own personal gold standard of really important diseases. And I think very telling, this is more than 20 times higher than the Government of India's official figure that you'll find on their website. And I don't blame the Government of India, they're victim of the underreporting, the lack of proper techniques for reporting snakebite. And because it's a nationwide study, it's possible to proportion the deaths through different states of India, and would provide the Government of India with the necessary information to deploy scarce resources where it was most needed. And this is exciting, an update. We're currently involved in reanalyzing data now, a 16-year period, right up to 2014, looking again at the number of deaths in India, but also expanding it to include the number of envenomings, of bites associated with injection of venom. And I can't tell you the results, but for me they're exciting because they're actually increasing, and of course that's a tragedy. I don't want there to be more deaths, but I feel that even those people who ignored the previous figure of 46,000 will just have to wake up now and take this seriously. The number of deaths in India is now higher than this. There have been some other well-designed studies in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka, which give us reliable figures. And there are also some excellent focal incidence studies. For example, in Africa, a number of studies just documenting the incidence of snakebite and snakebite deaths in small areas. The danger is, of course, that people will inappropriately extrapolate these figures up to the number of people in the whole country, and that's not valid at all, because often these studies, they choose areas that are notorious for their snakebite. And in Asia, of course, we have this absolute pathfinding study carried out by by Sanjeev Sharma and his colleagues in the Eastern Terai, the unprecedented figure of 162 deaths per 100,000 population per year. That's a staggering amount of snakebite attributable mortality, albeit in a restricted area in the Eastern Terai. But it really puts Nepal on the map, on the world scale, for severity of the challenge here. And now a second good reason for investing in snakebite is that although we now have some reliable data, we need a great deal more. As David Williams was saying this morning, we need more epidemiological evidence in other parts of the world. And I don't mean just reports of hospital-based studies. I mean properly designed community-based studies that will give a true representation, not only of deaths, but when you talk about the full burden of human suffering, you think about the survivors. We tend to think of survivors as being lucky. You know, they survive snakebite, but they can often be left with devastating residual problems. So you've probably seen maps like this based on the best guesstimates really, of snakebite deaths in each continent, and Asia is by far in the lead. I mean, those figures combined from Bangladesh and India alone would put it above any other continent. And Africa is the big unknown, and with the Latin America coming behind, and a serious problem in the island of New Guinea, and very few deaths in North America and Europe. So reliable data from well-designed studies suggest over 52,000 deaths a year in the combination of India, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So a global annual total of well over 100,000 deaths, and, very important, probably at least 400,000 survivors left with both physical sequelae. We can understand physical handicap, results of an amputation or contractures or something, but also emerging now, and we need better data for this, post-traumatic stress disorders of all sorts. And actually I've been bitten by a snake twice, and it is pretty worrying. You can understand how people can be left with persisting psychological morbidity after such a frightening event. Now this picture, which I've stolen from one of David Williams' presentations, is looking at a way of quantitating morbidity. And this is the concept of DALYs. And for those of you who don't really know what DALYs are, and you've got very good eyesight, by the way, if you're in the back, you can see an explanation of how you calculate DALYs, which is a sum actually of the years lost through premature death and the years impaired, as it were, through living with different grades of disability. And the important thing from this slide is that there are 6 million DALYs. That's the vertical scale here is in thousands. So 6 million DALYs, disability adjusted life years, attributable to snakebite. And you see that compared with these other famous neglected tropical diseases like soil transmitted helminths, more than any of the other neglected tropical diseases. And this is the sort of currency that we need to persuade granting agencies who have a very competitive applications to invest in snakebite. Now a third reason I think goes right to one's heart, which is that most victims of snakebite are children. That's immediately a concern to all of us, but also agricultural workers, food producers, cattle herds, and other sheep herds called pastoralists, usually nomadic people, or indigenous hunter-gatherers. So I think this picture, which I took with Sanjeev Sharma in a village in the Terai, I think it says it all. Why are children at risk from snakebite? You can see how mischievous they are, and where are their shoes, for goodness sake? So these are just, well, that's rather a facile way of looking at it, but it certainly converts into worrying data from the Indian Million Death Study, in all ages, the proportion of deaths from snakebite in India is 0.5%, but looking at that one age group, 5 to 14-year-olds, it's as high as 3% of all deaths are caused by snakebite. And it was highest in those states of India where children still are very much employed as labourers. Then other sorts of agricultural workers, you can see there top left in Myanmar, the paddy fields. Myanmar has a terrible problem of rice farming related Russell's viper bite. Top right, we have an example of plantation workers in southern and eastern Thailand, in rubber plantations who are bitten. And bottom left from Africa, farmers barefooted and barehanded. And bottom right, these are Tamil tea pickers in Sri Lanka. And some of the indigenous hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, again, these indigenous groups have a proven high risk and high incidence of snakebite. And although their populations are relatively tiny, they're quite threatened. Their survival is threatened. Now, fourth, which I think you're all beginning to appreciate, is that the medical, social and financial consequences of a snakebite, if you survive, can be absolutely devastating for the individual victim or to their family and the community as a whole. And you see here some examples from my own experience. The little boys from Brazil, one has lost an arm, one has lost a leg. Because of the transport difficulties, it took them hours, many hours to reach medical care and to receive antivenom to neutralize the venom. As a result, devastating local tissue damage. So here's a very good example of two little boys who survived snakebite, good for them, but who are left with appalling consequences for the rest of their lives. Top middle is a little girl bitten by by the way, I've put the incriminated snake in all these pictures, bitten by a spitting cobra in Nigeria, who's left with very severe hypertrophic scars, contractures, as a result of a healed snake bite. And the little girl from Thailand also got an unsightly contracture. And in the rather unforgiving societies where they live, in Africa and Southeast Asia, a girl impaired like that is much less likely to be married, to become married. It's a very cruel fate. And the chap on the right has had an amputation, someone from Ecuador. He will never be the same again. He can't be a productive agricultural worker. Now, I think a very important theme which we still underestimate and which is a very worthy target for investment is community education to reduce risk. And you promulgate these interventions, and they seem to be very simple and common sense things to us, but of course applying them to very poor communities who, involved in busy farm work, may have enormous practical difficulties. So this is really an absolute priority in controlling snakebite, and therefore a very worthy target for investment is to spread the message about reducing risk. We'll never eliminate the risk of snakebite, but we can reduce it substantially. And I've just been involved in an Australian-funded program, Myanmar Snakebite Project in Upper Burma, in Upper Myanmar. And I think this picture is very important for me. It shows that the way to start these community initiatives is in the community themselves. So here in this village in Upper Myanmar, we gathered together a group of leading citizens, teachers, NGO workers, and so on, government workers, and we asked them to come up with some ideas about how they might reduce snakebite in their village. And I found it quite inspiring. And I think the picture, you see a moment of enlightenment where they're suddenly, wow, why didn't we think of that before? You know, this is the obvious thing to do. And it's much more likely to be carried through if it comes from the community. And now of course, there's nothing better to promote snakebite prevention than a charismatic speaker. And here are two examples. My friend Dr. Sadinan Raut, sitting in the front row, talking to a group of relatives and survivors in Narangam in Maharashtra, and below the excellent Professor Abul Foiz, also sitting in the front row, explaining to some fishermen in Cox's Bazar how they might lower the risk of snakebite. And that is terribly important. And you don't need very senior people to do this. You can do this at every level. And the sort of things that it's useful to pass on to the community is to which are the most dangerous environments for dangerously venomous snakes, the habitats, and which times of year, because snakebite is very seasonal, which times of day. We all know about the night terror of nocturnal crate bites while you're sleeping on the floor of your dwelling at night. So this message needs to be spread. And which are the highest risk activities? Unfortunately, very often the highest risk activities are to do with agriculture, to do with employment, but also walking to and from the fields before dawn or after dusk. And what we have to promote is safer walking and safer working. And we can do that by providing footwear, encouraging people to carry lights after dark and to carry a stick. And these things are becoming more practicable now, with much less expensive batteries for torches and so on, and production of, you'll see in a minute, of suitable boots. And safer sleeping, either sleep off the ground or under a well-tucked-in mosquito net. So here's my colleague in Myanmar, my oldest friend there, Dr. Utung Pei, and he developed a lightweight boot which rice farmers found acceptable during the harvest season. No farmer's going to wear boots during the transplanting season in the flooded fields. Clearly, that'd be nonsense. But a lot of the bites occur during the harvesting. And this is a lightweight boot. And it's being tested here by a volunteer Russell's Viper that's been incentivized. If you can penetrate this boot, you get a free rat. And it was unable to penetrate the boot. Then there's the sleeping. This is a good example of how protective measures against snakebite overlap with other major disease control programs. Clearly, the vector-borne diseases like malaria and so on. So these girls sleeping on the floor, they're safe from prowling crates at night. It's easy to think that we're in the high ground as far as knowledge is concerned, but I think we need to be humble. We need to learn things from indigenous populations who've lived with venomous snakes for many years. And I've been most impressed in my travels around the world. I've called this ancient wisdom. What can be learned from Australia's Aboriginal people? The Australian Aborigines had to learn to survive in an environment shared with some of the world's most venomous snakes. You know how Australians show off about their deadly snakes. If the cricket's going badly, they talk about the venomous snakes. But anyway, they certainly do have a pretty deadly combination of venomous snakes in Australia. And it's clear from these 19th century, early 19th century accounts of some of the indigenous tribes that deaths from snakebite were remarkably rare. So what can we learn from about that? I was very privileged a few years ago to meet an informer, Russell Butler, from a tribe variously known as the Banjan or Banjin, who used to occupy Hinchinbrook Island before they were genocided from there in the colonial times, I'm sorry to say. And he confirmed that snake bites were practically unknown in this tribe. And I said, well, how do you avoid them? This is what I mean by ancient wisdom. Walking through the bush in single file, respecting snakes, never attacking them, burning off areas before camping, knowing the peak season. They looked for the presence of indicator plants which flowered or came up during that peak snakebite season. And if you were bitten, this was regarded as a punishment for breaking these codes, and so on. So you may think I'm going a bit over the top with ancient wisdom, but I think those of us who feel that we know something about snakebite, we've read the literature, we've had our own clinical experience, I think we do need to retain an element of humility with people who've actually lived intimately with venomous snakes and survived for years. This, by the way, is the local remedy, the cocky apple, which they use for treating snakebite. So, how can we promulgate prevention? And I think this is really an area for a scope for imagination and innovation. Any sort of educational material. I was delighted to see a children's story from Lois just before the meeting, which again is a way of publicising the risk of snakebite. Any sort of pamphlet, radio, media, increasingly social media, and puppet shows in one of the jungle areas in northern Kenya. It's a very dramatic way of portraying snakebite and what you should and should not do afterwards. So here's just two examples of locally produced books or pamphlets detailing how the elementary ways of reducing the risk of snakebite. So I want to just point out briefly, because if any of you are health administrators, Ministry of Health people, you will have a limited budget. And I want to try and persuade you that the interventions which we are advocating for snakebite have wide application and benefit to other major diseases. So here are some examples. So for snakebite prevention, I've already mentioned these: awareness of high-risk times, safer working, safer sleeping. Now, which other disease programs might benefit from the interventions? So many diseases are climate-related, season-related. For example, vector-borne diseases. So the cycles, the annual cycles of snakebite may make people more aware of that. There are all manner of traumas that people can suffer particularly to their lower limbs, their feet, in remote areas, in rural areas. I've listed a few there: ordinary trauma from thorns leading to chronic tropical ulcers, and inoculated pathogens such as Buruli ulcer, deep fungal infections, soil-transmitted helminths, a very common thing. You know, the filiform larvae, say of hookworm, invade through the sole of the feet in areas, contaminated areas around latrines. Wearing footwear will protect against these, and a whole lot of other fascinating tropical diseases there. And the mosquito nets, needless to say, will protect you from malaria, leishmaniasis in parts of Latin America, bartonellosis, and other vector-borne diseases, and ectoparasites, nuisances like fleas and lice. Now, improving hospital management of snakebite. This is something we should do by promoting appropriate on-the-spot first aid, and one method that's been receiving increasing support is the pressure pad. Rapid access to medical care. First of all, to try tactfully to discourage what we would regard as time wasted with traditional healers. We know that many patients spend days perhaps with the traditional healer before the deterioration in their condition prompts a move to medical care. And encouraging early, safe, passive transportation, and preventing death on the way to hospital, for example, from respiratory arrest and from shock, and so on. So here is the pressure pad method. This is it's one of my favorite slides in the whole of tropical medicine, from Sanjeev and the Swiss-Nepal collaboration, BP Coralla Institute collaboration, in which they recruited village-based motorcyclists to carry patients quickly to hospital in areas where there are no roads suitable for vehicles. And this is not a this is not a posed photograph. Sanjeev assures me this is genuine, and I'm sorry they weren't wearing helmets. The WHO gave us a bad time trying to use this picture, because not only that, but the child was not protected from exhaust burn. So anyway, ignore that. This is a perfect way to carry someone in early paralysis after a presumed cobra bite to the nearest medical care, which would be one of the Red Cross clinics perhaps in the Terai area. And preventing death on the way, training ambulance workers, if you're lucky enough to have ambulances, and other medical staff to create an artificial airway and to maintain breathing, even though the patient has gone into respiratory obstruction or respiratory paralysis. So these improvements in pre-hospital management will certainly impact on other diseases. So I've mentioned these already. That's in snakebite. So the other conditions, appropriate first aid will be very important for a whole lot of things like controlling bleeding, very common road traffic accidents. Rapid access is important for so many acute medical conditions. Think of obstructed labour, and Sanjeev's motorcycle system has been used successfully in Zambia, for example, for evacuating women with obstructed labour, and keeping people alive until they reach medical care, again, applies to so many other conditions. Now, the sixth reason for investing in snakebite is based on a sort of confidence that modern scientific-based allopathic or Western medicine really can provide effective, specific and supportive treatments to save life and limb, so to prevent death and to prevent some of the physical consequences of snakebite that I've already illustrated. And we have to have faith in our own scientific medicine here. I'm not saying that there isn't need for critical examination of all we do by continuing research, but I think we have enough now on which to base solid guidelines and recommendations. So the key here, I think, is training medical staff in basic clinical skills of history taking and examination, a simple blood clotting test that can be done anywhere without sophisticated equipment. The best we have at the moment is the 20-minute whole blood clotting test. It's certainly not perfect. We do need to find a replacement, but until that replacement is available and affordable, I think we must just use the 20-minute whole blood clotting test as carefully and as critically as we can. We need to train people in the intravenous administration of antivenom. As we were saying this afternoon, antivenom has to be given in. Critically, that anyone who gives antivenom must be able to identify that common, remarkably common and life-threatening complication of antivenom treatment, which is anaphylaxis. A terrifying term, acute anaphylaxis, capable of causing very rapid death. It must be not only identified, but treated early with adrenaline, with epinephrine. And that's the training we need, but we also need to provide some equipment and safe, effective antivenom with appropriate storage, the means of assisted ventilation and renal replacement therapy. You've got a speaker on acute kidney injury later today, and wound care and surgical debridement or skin grafting, which is very important for accelerating recovery from what can be really devastating areas of skin loss. Finally, as a point that David Williams emphasised this morning, that most neglected of aspects of snakebite treatment, which is rehabilitation. It's not enough just to save life and get them out of hospital. You've got to, if you're going to get them back to productive work, you've got to do everything possible to restore function in the bitten limb, and to give appropriate advice too about how they could reduce the risk of being bitten again. So here's some examples of clinical training, classical clinical methods, the 20-minute whole blood clotting test, and this example from Kenya of a very extensive loss of skin after an ashes spitting cobra bite shows the challenges faced by medical staff. Even though this little girl has survived her snake bite, there's a long way to go before she can be restored to anything like normal activity in life. And to provide safe, effective, affordable treatment, we've got to train our staff to administer antivenoms safely. And medical staff, I don't mean doctors necessarily. In Myanmar, midwives can give antivenom, health assistants, district health officers and so on. We must accept and realise that snakebite is treated by a whole range of people. And one of my first friends in Nepal was actually a Red Cross worker who corresponded with me prodigiously over many years. I got a file of his letters that thick, interspersed with beautiful pictures of Mount Everest and so on, to keep me interested. And you can imagine his problems. He had no skills with airways, he had no antivenom, and yet he was inundated with snakebite victims. And this is the reality. And I hope tomorrow we will hear from some of the frontline doctors from the smaller hospitals and clinics around Nepal, so that we can, you can share your experiences with us of trying to treat snakebite with absolute minimum of resources. It's so important. Surgical skills being taught here. The surgeon will go back to Egypt very soon, but he's training an African to do debridement of necrotic tissue. There's the whole process of antivenom production, deployment and storage, and then rehabilitation illustrated. You've seen one of these characters before, the little girl on the extreme right of the picture. It's left with a spastic paraparesis following a spinal artery thrombosis from Russell's Viper in Sri Lanka. And she's on a long road to eventual recovery, restoration of function. So again, emphasizing the overlap with other diseases. Here are the things I've suggested are important, the training and the provisions, and looking at other diseases. Basic skills of history and examination are crucial for all of medicine. And I strongly believe that if we train our medical staff to look after snakebite patients properly, and I mean conventional history, examination, diagnosis and treatment, we will benefit the management of all manner of other diseases, including these rapidly emerging non-communicable diseases like diabetes mellitus and a whole range of other conditions. So we're not just training snakebite doctors. That's the point I want to make. We're training doctors to be better doctors, whatever medical problem faces them. The bedside 20-minute whole blood clotting test is useful because there are other causes of coagulopathy, of bleeding dialysis. I think snakebite is probably the commonest in Asia, but there are things like sepsis and postpartum hemorrhage. Intravenous administration of drugs is a basic skill, and identifying anaphylaxis and treating it confidently. Again, anaphylaxis can be provoked by a whole manner of allergens and antibiotics, as you all know. And many doctors are frightened of anaphylaxis because it can kill so quickly. One minute you have a patient with very early symptoms, the next minute they've got no blood pressure, they've got bronchospasm, and so on. They're moribund. Then for other diseases, what we need, safe, effective antivenom. I'm a strong believer that antivenom manufacture should be combined with production of anti-sera for other diseases, antitoxins, but also things like anti-tetanus, anti-diphtheria toxin, but also rabies immune globulin. The skills, the techniques are the same in both cases. Assisted ventilation, vital for all other acute medical conditions, wound care, skin injury, think of burns. Think of all the skill that's been learnt about dealing with devastating skin loss from burns and ulcerating conditions. And again, when we talk about the importance of rehabilitation and giving some patients advice before they leave hospital about how they can avoid a recurrent exposure to this disease, again it applies to everything else. So in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that training people to look after snakebite patients according to modern standards and expectations will prepare them to be better doctors, better health workers for everything else. Now, I'm absolutely on the edge of my experience here. I have had to treat a few animals with snakebite in the United Kingdom as well as in Africa and Southeast Asia. I think this is something we forget, and I'm very glad there's a speaker tomorrow who is going to emphasize this, the One Health philosophy. We must remember that snakes don't just bite humans, and we're only just beginning to understand the scale of loss, of economic loss from domestic animals killed by snake bites, but also, of course, pet animals also can be attacked by snakes. And we should collaborate with our veterinary colleagues. So here are some the few data I have. We know from colonial days in India that more than 3,000 cattle were killed in a year. That's a very old figure from the 19th century. We need more recent data. Some antivenoms are manufactured specifically for animals, and this is a bit controversial, but you know, when a stock of antivenom becomes time expired, it's beyond the manufacturer's date. It's a terrible waste to throw that away if you've got veterinarians in the region who are wanting to treat animals. Because we know, I'm not promoting double standards for animals here. I can see some animal activists getting agitated for that. What I'm saying is, don't waste antivenom. We know that the so-called expired antivenom may still have a great deal of potency. And I've used expired antivenom in England to treat many dogs and cats and small monkeys too, with very good results. So just a thought. Now, I'm up to 7 now. Don't worry, I'm soon finishing, and then we'll have lunch and recover. Now, there's a global shortage of proven safe, effective, and affordable and accessible antivenoms. This is a theme that's going to be taken up by colleagues later today and tomorrow. And I'm very glad that there are some antivenom producers here. Some are preparing to produce antivenoms, perhaps nationally for Nepal, and some are current exporters of antivenom to Nepal. We really need to address this problem together. And this is a slide taken from the WHO roadmap, the strategy for control and prevention of snakebite. And I won't go into detail. The left is from a paper by my colleagues in Nigeria and West Africa, showing that actually antivenom treatment can be very cost effective based on the sort of calculations that health economists do involving DALYs averted for a particular expenditure. So it's a good deal. If you invest in antivenoms, it's a very productive deal. And part of the strategy of WHO, and I'm sure David Williams will be talking about this a bit later, is to stockpile selected approved antivenoms in areas of need to allow more efficient distribution and to try and redress the appalling shortages of antivenom that are suffered in many parts of the world. Number 8, now healthcare systems. Improving healthcare systems will benefit snakebite victims, but will again benefit all other categories or other diagnoses as well. And back to transport, here are some examples of the challenges of transporting snake-bitten patients as rapidly as possible and as passively as possible. You don't want them running over the fields. That's the worst possible thing for spread of venom from the bite site. So here's a little girl being transported by river during floods in Sindh province in Pakistan, and I don't like the look of her at all. I think she's got advanced paralysis, so that looks a bit of a tragedy. Top right is the top end. Here's a South African military helicopter evacuating a victim of bergadder bite in South Africa from Drakensberg. Bottom left is a real life situation, appropriate treatment, evacuation of someone bitten in the rainforest of Honduras. And again, bottom right, this is not a stage photograph. An Australian friend of mine who was bitten in a remote area of northern coast of Papua New Guinea. He was an expert, so of course he picked up a deadly snake, thinking it was a harmless one, and he was lucky enough to find some very cooperative local people who built him this beautiful stretcher and carried him in teams for nearly 12 hours to the nearest hospital in Medan and saved his life. So these are examples where there is a need for improving health systems to facilitate transport to medical care, access to medical care. But there are lots of other clever things, and I thought I had to put this in. This is Taiwan, which is certainly not a developing country. It's a very wealthy country with a very strong toxicological, toxinological, and scientific community. And here's something for the future: distribution of antivenoms by drone. Isn't that a nice idea? So that's a distant prospect, I know, but it just shows that we've got to think broadly if we're going to tackle these problems of distribution and conservation of antivenom. Now, my penultimate, my number 9 argument for investing in snakebite now, not tomorrow, but now, is that at the stage of development, the awakening of interest in snakebite as a public health problem, a relatively small investment of any of the things I've described, not just money, is likely to yield a disproportionately large benefit in affected populations. And I don't have any data for that, so you may think this is a soft argument, but I have at least produced a picture there showing that steep part of the curve where a small amount of investment. So I'd like to think that for example, Rotary in Nepal, in Kathmandu, very generous investment. I think you can expect a disproportionately large yield and measurable, evident yield from that investment. And this is the message I would like to give to all investors. And again, I'm not just talking about investment of money. Effort invested in snakebite, I think, will have the same potential benefit. Now, finally, this is a problem with snakebite. We're never going to eradicate it. We can't vaccinate against it. And these were two of the reasons why some of the big foundations in the early days wouldn't think of snakebite. If we can't eradicate it, we're just not interested. And I haven't claimed we can eradicate it. I've said we can reduce risk. We can reduce numbers of bites, and by improving access and treatment, quality of treatment, we can reduce death and morbidity. But we're never going to eliminate or eradicate snakebite. But we are in a position to control it. Use that word control, using existing methods. So if there were no other discoveries in the history of snakebite research, and I sincerely hope that's not the case, if there were no more discoveries, using existing methods, we could make an enormous difference, I believe, by applying them effectively. And just 2 success stories here. So snakebite can be controlled. First of all, Brazil, where I worked for many years, we have historical figures from the famous Vital Brazil, who founded antivenom production at the very beginning of the 20th century in Sao Paulo. And in his day, he estimated over 19,000 bites, with nearly 5,000 deaths, a case fatality rate of 25%. By 1949, the numbers had reduced, but still had declined, but still very considerable. And now the latest figures, and the Ministry of Health in Brazil has an excellent surveillance system, epidemiological system, and I strongly recommend you go onto this website and you'll see detailed figures for incidents of bites, stings by scorpions and so on, and deaths. And for the last, since 2000, there's been an average of about 104 deaths from snakebite a year, although the number of bites is apparently increasing, probably because of improved surveillance. I think that's very impressive. Here's a country that by producing antivenom nationally, deploying it effectively, and training medical staff right out to the periphery, they've replaced the idea of referring snake bites to the tertiary hospitals in the capital. They've replaced that strategy with treating snake bites at the most peripheral level of the health service. And I think the benefits have been most impressive. And another country where I've worked for a long time, Thailand, and there again you see that back in the 1940s, over 200 deaths a year. By the 50s, some evidence of decline, and so on through the 60s. And currently in Thailand, there are usually less than 20 deaths from snakebite a year, even though snakebite is an enormous problem in Thailand. So here again, investment in a nationally produced antivenom, which is widely deployed, and training of medical staff, and public education, public awareness, has yielded tremendous benefits. So my final slide, I'm going to abandon the position that you might expect from an academic, an Oxford professor. And I'm going to be a bit in your face, because I would say, whoever you are and wherever you are, invest in snakebite now. And it's a winner. And how do we know it's a winner? Because you'll get this sort of experience, you clinicians in the audience. In both these cases, from Papua New Guinea on the left, a taipan bite, from Thailand, a Malayan crate bite. Both cases, these children have been nursed back from the point of death from respiratory paralysis to where they are almost ready to leave hospital. This is the reward. This is the visible and tangible reward. So please, get emotional about this. Forget the detail, but remember the message. We all have to invest in snakebite now, and that would be my particular message for Nepal. You've had the vision to create this meeting, to organise this meeting. Take it forward from there. Thank you very much.